our Advent members. We're not doing a printed book this year. I've got a few printed copies, just a simple printout for those of you who don't have internet access or don't read that way. But there's a daily email you can sign up for through the church website, or we're posting them every day on the church's Facebook page, and you can access them that way. And I'll just tell you preemptively, this is my, I think, 19th year of doing the Advent devotional book here.
Wow.
And with no disrespect to anyone who's ever written before, this collective set is, I believe, the strongest set we've ever had. Really, really good stuff there overall, and really, really pleased with that. Hang of the Green is next Sunday, the 8th, in the evening, and hope you'll come back for that at 6:30. The Giving Tree is up in James Gallery if you'd like to participate in that. The Tree of Remembrance is right here outside this door if you'd like to take an ornament and write on there the remembrance name of someone who is either battling an illness now, or someone who's passed who you'd like to remember. There are instructions there for different ways to do that. Please partake of that. And there are a lot of service opportunities listed in the tapestry today, so you can find all of those as well. Dave, I think Kathy needs some handouts. There's 2 handouts today. So let me tell you about the handouts today. We're starting an Advent series that may go just a week or 2 beyond Advent into Christmas time on Christmas carols. And I've given you a thing from the BBC that I want to tell you up front. This is historical humor, all right? So it's almost satire, but it's also true. So it has that real British sense of humor about it. Some of you may be put off and wonder, why in the world have I given you this? I've given it to you because it's funny, and it's really well written, and it pokes fun at the history of Christmas carols, which is one of the things we'll be talking about today at the beginning, is where this whole notion of Christmas carols has come from as well. An interesting background. It's much more complex than we think. And then my intent over the next few weeks is to take 1 or 2 Christmas carols each week and talk about that. The other handout for today is about a specific carol we'll be talking about today, O Come, Emmanuel. So that's what you've got in the 2 handouts today. All right. Lots of good going on. Glad to see all of you here today. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the history of Christmas Carol that is quite a bit more complicated than even I realized. I think most of us think that most of our Christmas carols just popped into being sometime in the 18th or 19th century or before, and they've happily moved along, and we're part of this long tradition with that. And it's not quite that simple. The word carol itself is a relatively newish word in the history of the world, of the English-speaking language. A carol initially was just a celebratory song that included dancing. There is no exclusive connection to Christmas with the origins of the word carol. These were traditional verse and refrain formats, or in the old school they called it stanza and burden, is the old language for this. And it had nothing to do with church at all. So we think of Christmas carols as being the domain of the church, and that is true today, but it was not true originally. Now, just as we think today, there are secular Christmas songs, chestnuts roasting on an open fire, right? Santa Baby, which, by the way, is a horrible song.
No. Grandma got run over by reindeers.
Grandma got run over. White Christmas, all of these things, right? And we are able to make a distinction that those are not songs we sing in church. And so we wouldn't call them Christmas carols, in a sense, right? So different things. Here's the problem, though. the songs we love as Christmas carols also didn't begin largely in the church. A few did, but most did not. In the early days, choirs sang church music, and everyone else outside church sang carols. Now, there's an interesting tale from about 1400 AD called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight that got translated by none other than J.R.R. Tolkien. And that poem, that tale, became one of the first carols, which gives you a little history of this, right? These were often songs on Christian themes that were sung in the fields or at the graveyard and in semi-magical processions around the parish. Their text often covered not just the Christmas season, but the entire Christian worldview from creation to resurrection. They were a way of telling a story. And so we, over time, have pulled snippets of those. So, for example, Tomorrow Shall Be My Dancing Day is a Renaissance kind of piece that was part of a larger cycle. We know the Christmas part of it. That's not how the medieval folks used these songs at all. So then they started mixing English and Latin together in some of these. That's why if you've ever heard, we've sung this here before, some of our choirs have, this is an Old English song that goes, there is no rose of such virtue as is the rose that bare Jesu. And then it has a Latin phrase thrown in there, res miranda. Well, why is that? It's not just to be clever, that's the way they did it back in those times. So, by the 16th century, so the 1500s, the word carol was loosely applied to any song with a seasonal connection, whatever the season may be. But it was still not just about Christmas at all. Now, there came a time when Protestants, after the Reformation, during the Reformation, wanted to take back the best tunes from the devil and the pub. So you do understand that many of our hymns, the tunes to our hymns originated as pub songs. And this is true of many of our Christmas carols. They were folk songs sung in pubs that got drafted into the service of the church as a way of sanctifying them, right? So alongside this, there was this passion growing for education of the common folks. And so school songbooks popped up. This was an early version of music education in schools, and it was through these carols that theology was imparted to young children. And many of our best-known carols intersect that at some point along the way. Now,
well, you said schools and theology, so back then the schools were religious
Oh,
schools,
yeah.
is that right?
Yeah.
So that's where they brought them in.
the church was the only one educating
Okay.
at that time. Then by the middle of the 17th century, so mid-1600s, there was a more extreme brand of Protestantism that took hold in England, and you know about them. They're the Puritans. And we love to beat up on the Puritans, and with good reason, because they very famously banned Christmas. Boo. Puritan equals Scrooge. Well, why did they ban Christmas? Because it had too much merriment, and it was too bawdy, and had become a celebration about things that were not respectable for the church as they saw it. Now, obviously, something happened along the way, and one author I'm reading says, the jollity, of course, came back in a great whirl of enthusiasm at the Restoration in 1660, and carols became mainly an excuse for having fun. Songs about drinking, wassailing, drinking, eating, dancing, and drinking were especially popular. Do you notice a common theme in that description?
Let's bring it back.
So wassail to you, yeah. So the idea of congregational hymn singing in carols in the 18th century finally gave us some familiar carols like while shepherds watched their flocks by night. But it was still on this old-fashioned metrical, very metrical kind of idea, right? Then along come two figures you know probably, the Wesley brothers, Charles and John, founders of Methodism, and writers of hundreds of hymns, including some carols, and Isaac Watts. Between the two of them, they began advocating and writing these songs that end up becoming part of our Christmas tradition as well. So fast forward mid-19th century, so middle 1800s, people began to collect these folk songs. And what's interesting about most of them is they were regional. So think pre-telephone, pre-telegram, pre-internet. Many things were isolated. And what these researchers, mainly academics and clergy, discovered was if you went from region to region, you would find different Christmas carols being sung, sometimes to the same tune but with different words. And so this is one of the reasons that if you start researching some of your favorite Christmas carols, you're going to find that there are multiple ways of singing that same carol. It's not because someone's been devious, it's just that they took root in different places, and then over time there was sort of an amalgamation, getting down to the most common variations on those. And that happened in the early 20th century, so not long, less than 100 years ago. People went out into the highways and hedges, heard these songs, brought them back, cleaned them up, published them along the way. And you can read more about that if you'd like to. This is one of the reasons a lot of Christmas carols, we have no idea who wrote the text, because it's just lost in the mists of time. And there were enough variations that maybe one person wrote this part, and another person wrote this part, and another person wrote this part, and they all got jammed together into what we know today. So it was in the 19th century that the church began to make a contribution of its own. And clergy played a significant role as editors, translators, composers, arrangers, and authors. It was not uncommon in an earlier era for clergymen to be trained in music and to be the ones who brought together the editing and arranging of music for the church. And some of these then were written in America, not in England. And so you had an organ that was suddenly available to go with these in the Victorian era. But even so, here's the main point I want to make. The singing of Christmas, so when you talk about carolers, so think like Dickens, and the Dickens scene, and you have these carolers out in the street. That's the way Christmas caroling began. In the street, with the common people, in the pubs, in the public places, not in the church. Far, far more outside the church than inside the church. So here's one comment on this. The sight of carol singers merrily tramping from door to door now has vanished to such an extent that we could easily forget just how familiar and widespread the practice was until surprisingly recently. The carol used to be an outdoor creature, a farmyard animal as much as a domestic pet. It was not done in the church. It was the secular version of singing in those days. So this is a folk tradition that we pull from here. And if you think about the Christmas carols that you know, and you try to figure out, how do I know that? How do I know that song? Well, you may be able to think back, and I mean, I remember some songs that were on a record album when I was a kid that my parents had, that they got at the Firestone Tire Place. You know that album? Right? It was like the Reader's Digest compilation version. And it had some good stuff on it. Or it was a sample CD, or LP, or whatever with that. But a lot of times we just know them because we know them. This is so deeply embedded in our culture. And don't be surprised if you find someone along the way, you probably already have, who knows them differently than you do. Has anyone had an experience where you've met someone who knew a Christmas carol in a different way than you? Okay, can you think of an example of that?
Got a great story. My mom's from Texas and my dad's from Michigan. And so I grew up with this weird combination, and they knew the same Christmas carols but different words. So I learned all kinds of words to Christmas carols.
Yeah, someone else with a story about that? Yeah, Helen?
My first grade friend she started off singing Away in a Manger. The words were the same, but the tune was completely different.
Yeah.
Okay, different tune, same words, right?
When Bob and I were first married, we lived in Germany, and so one Christmas we went to the Holy Lands, and we were in Bethlehem on Christmas Eve, and I was expecting to get this most holy feeling. None of the music was familiar. Some of it might have been from the Anglican
Yes.
tradition, I don't know. But that was a disappointment, and then it was so commercial. But
Well, and I think you've gotten to an interesting point about Christmas music. For many of us, it's an emotion more than a reality, which is not, I'm not poo-pooing Christmas carols here or Christmas music, but there's an emotional tug because of our history that sometimes overpowers the theological message or the history or the meaning of any of these songs, because it's like smelling fresh bread baking in the oven. It gives you a sensory feeling, right, that takes you back to another time, perhaps your childhood, perhaps some other happier time in your life, or whatever. Does that make sense? Anyone else have a story about Christmas carols in your past and crazy mixed up Christmas carols?
There is one thing, when you sing it in a different language, it is really different. I mean, it was a beautiful song, but like, it's totally different.
So if you sing in a different language,
Yes.
and we need to remember some of our carols did not originate in English as well. Stille Nacht is a perfect example of that. Oh, Christmas Tree, Oh Tannenbaum, right? And there's a lot of stories out there about Christmas carols that are just wrong. If you want to read more about this, there are a number of books available at your local bookstore or through Amazon or your favorite online retailer that you can find. I downloaded several this week for like $2.99 in the Kindle edition. Just go look up History of Christmas Carols, and you can find several good resources there. It's a cheap read along the way. Jim?
You were saying so many of them were sung in the streets, the carols back then.
Right.
But all the songs that were done back then, we always think of as Christmas carols that have words about Christ and Jesus and being born. Yet today, we have lots of songs. We need a lot of Christmas, things like that.
Right.
Were there songs back then that were of the time, but not of Christ?
So Jim, that's a great question, and that's like asking, was there non-religious art in that time too? And the answer is yes, but the prominent theme that was allowed to be propagated by the church, even in the community, would have been religious ideas, right? And so you see a lot of that has at least a leaning into the biblical story. But again, often it was the big thing, the full biblical story, or some bigger chunk than just Christmas for that. So today, to begin with, I want us to talk about a Christmas carol that actually does have its roots in the church and has a really interesting story behind it. Some of you have heard this before in part, but every time I read or research this, I learn more about it, and it's a fascinating one of our Advent carols, and by that I mean one that's not just full on Christmas, that's anticipatory, is O Come, Emmanuel. The Latin Veni, Veni, Emmanuel. And go Google this, and there's like 1,000 recordings from everybody. If you've got a Christmas album, you probably have this on it somewhere, regardless of whether you're religious or not. It's in there. This has been a part of Western Christianity since for several hundred years, actually. But there is a theological basis behind it that I want to talk about, and then if we have time, we'll come back and talk more about that as well. The text of this carol is built upon what's called the 7 O's, like capital letter O, the 7 O's, which are known as antiphons. And this is a series of prayers that invoke Christ by one of the names or titles Christ is given in Scripture, ending with a supplication framed around that image. So, the single-page handout I gave you shows you what the 7 O's are. So, in the Latin, which is the second column, it goes O sapientia, O arbiter, O radix, O clavis, Origo, Rex, O Emmanuel. And you see the English translation on the left. The first O is O wisdom, then O Lord and ruler of Israel, O root of Jesse, O key of David, O dawn, O King of nations, O Emmanuel. And what would happen in the Catholic Church of the past, but this still is used today, is that this would be a series of 7 days leading up to Christmas. And at evensong, one of the O's would be the focus. So you would begin out with O wisdom, right? And there's a scriptural text that goes with each one of these. And if we have time in just a minute, I want us to take a look at some of those scriptural texts as well. Oh my goodness, do I want to talk about that or not? Oh yeah, this is interesting. Okay. So there was an Anglo-Saxon poet who actually has what obviously is a Welsh name, Cunwulf, who wrote something called The Christ around 750 or 800. And in the first part of this writing, called Advent, he intersperses the gospel of Mary and Joseph with a series of reflections that echo the language and imagery of the great O's. And there was an English translation of this published in 1892 and so forth. One of the verses goes, O thou ruler and thou righteous king, thou keeper of the keys that open life, bless us with victory, with a bright career denied unto another if his work is worthless. And what's interesting about this, that was built upon the 7 great O's, the antiphons, is that this edition of that writing provided much of the imagery and names that Tolkien used, including, he got the words Arendelle and Middle-earth out of that writing. So those of you who are Tolkien fans, there's your trivia for the day on this. So what happens with the antiphons is they're each one like a prophecy of Isaiah that's shown through to its fulfillment. So it's this is early apologetics, Chad. Here's the prophecy, here's the fulfillment, right? It shows you where we've come from in the Old Testament prophecy, and then that. And so the 7 antiphons are sung before and after the Magnificat at Vespers on the last 7 days of Advent, which is December 17 through 23. And these have survived for a long, long time. But our hymnals today, when we sing this, it only has 5 verses. There originally were 7 plus, because there's 7 great O's, 7 antiphons. And somewhere along the way, a couple of those got dropped. Now, if you go research this, you're going to find a conspiracy theory out there that I want to debunk. And that is, here's the way it goes. If you take the initial letters of the Latin words after the O, so it's Sapientia, Adonai, Radix, Clavis, Oriens, Rex, Gentium, Emmanuel, and you rearrange the first letters backward, it says Eroc, Ros, in Latin, which some people believe to mean tomorrow I will be, and it's a message of, or tomorrow I will come. It's an Advent message, it's a secret code built into the great antiphons. It doesn't matter, but it's accidental, unless you want to believe that it's not. If you need a message from God in that, you can find it. You can find it. We'll look at the things. So I want to tell you how this got picked up and brought into our American culture, though. There were two people who were really key to this, and you'll see their credit if you look at this in our hymnal. John Mason Neal and Thomas Helmore. Neal was the one who published the Latin version of this, Veni, Veni, Emmanuel, in 1851. And he thought it had been written in the 12th century. The reality is that it probably goes back to the 1700s. It may not have been as early as that. We don't know, though, where the original verses came from. They were written and picked up along the way. Other contributions were made to it by several others. So Neal, a guy named T.A. Lacey, and then a fascinating guy has a part in this story, is Henry Sloane Coffin. Now, those of you who know our Baptist history and American Protestant history are thinking, now wait a minute, I thought his name was William Sloane Coffin. William Sloane Coffin was the legendary first pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City. Well, I had to go research this yesterday because I thought they got his name wrong. Well, the timing is wrong too. Henry Sloane Coffin was William Sloane Coffin's uncle. And he was the president of Union Theological Seminary in New York and a Presbyterian minister. His brother, William Sloane Coffin's father, was president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Crazy, right?
Were they the ones who started putting bodies in boxes and before they go in the ground?
I don't know.
Just kidding.
I don't know. Sloane Coffin. Yeah.
Oh, please.
Yeah, I got it. So William Sloane Coffin's uncle is one of the people who perpetuated this particular carol in American churches, and one of the reasons that we sing it today, which I thought was pretty interesting. The tune to this hymn, we don't really know where it comes from, but it seems to have been a French folk tune, or it was discovered probably in Lisbon by the guy named Neal, right? Somewhere in 1853, 1854, when he was in Madeira, and he was recuperating. There's a whole other story behind that, why he was sent there. He was sent there rather than going to a big parish, an Anglican parish, because his health was poor. And in this out-of-the-way place, he discovered this tune that got attached to this Christmas carol that's now one of our most beloved things, all because this clergyman got sent into exile because of his health. So there's a positive story there if you'd like to know that as well. Let me stop and ask questions about that before we move on to discuss some of the scripture behind it. Anyone have something to add to that story that you know? All right. Let's see. We've got we got a little time to do this. So I need some Bible readers. I need someone to read Isaiah 7:14. Who'll do that? Isaiah 7:14.
If I can find it, Mark.
Okay, let's go to David here on this. I need someone to read Matthew 1:23. Can you find it? Matthew 1:23. I need someone to go to Isaiah 11 and find the bit there about root of Jesse.
Okay.
Okay? I need someone to read Malachi 4:2. All right, David? I need someone to read Isaiah 22:22. One more? Okay, Lynette. And then the last one, okay, Adonai. Well, we'll leave that alone for right now. Okay, so if you think about this, and I'm sorry I didn't print out the actual hymn. That's the mistake I made. I didn't print out the actual hymn. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel.
And it's
Right.
in a minor key, too.
It's also in this chant, because it comes out of sort of that chant tradition. In fact, one of the complaints about the modern usage of this carol is that we've smoothed it over too much. Because in reality, it ought to have a more irregular chant feel to it than it does. But, that doesn't sell commercially. And so we just smooth the whole thing down like we sanded a board, right? So it goes down easier for American audiences.
Question, whenever I hear the hymn, the tune, I think of a Hebrew song, that kind of a feel. But
Yeah,
at the same time.
but it's not.
But also, well, probably not, yeah. But also the words in there all seem to, I don't know, if maybe one or two seem to actually refer to Christ, but the rest of them are prophecy.
Oh, so again, the point of the text is to take prophecies and show their fulfillment. So there's a linkage in each one. So let's start with the first verse. That is a pull from Isaiah 7:14 and references Matthew 1:23. So who's got Isaiah 7:14? Okay.
Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel.
David, would you look in the cabinet behind you and see if there's a hymnal? You got it right here? We're fine then.
Come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear.
So you see the connection here? And then Matthew 1:23.
The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us.
So this is the beginning of this, and we find this connection drawn from that passage. And then the second verse, Anna.
Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel, shall come to thee, O Israel.
Oh, that's the chorus. So give us the next verse.
That's
come,
two
come,
of them.
somebody.
O come, thou day spring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight.
Okay, who's got Malachi 4:2? Yeah, David.
But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall.
So the word dayspring gets used in some translations in English there, but if you're thinking through this, there's also a connection in that verse to another well-known Christmas carol. Read it again, the first part.
But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its
There
wings.
you go. Risen with healing in his wings. Right?
Yes.
That's where that's from as well. So there's an overlap in these two things, right? Yeah, Hark the Herald is, by the way, one of the all-time greats theologically, in my views. So we learn in this passage that the Messiah will bring justice, honesty, truth, enlightenment, and will cast out darkness. The Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his wings. And so come day spring and cheer us. What's the next verse, Anna?
O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear.
Is
Oh,
there
that's, okay, here, the
is there
one after
about the
that.
rod of Jesse or branch of Jesse?
I have the full lyrics here. So, let me find another one.
Or is there what about the key of David?
Let's see.
This is 5.
Verse
O
5?
come, O key of David, come and open wide our heavenly home. Make space for us, heavenward road, and bar the way to death's abode.
So you may be wondering, what is the key of David? right? Is this some magical relic that we need to be on a mission for? Isaiah 22:22 is the reference here. Who's got that?
I have that one.
Okay.
I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and no one shall shut. He shall shut and no one shall open.
Ooh, how about that? There's a name for Jesus I bet you haven't thought of before. Key of David. Well, what do you think that means in comparison with this, and why is that an Advent thought for us? Anybody? Okay, y'all have not been to Sunday school enough. The answer is Jesus, right? Jesus is the key. Jesus is the key that unlocks God's mystery. Jesus is the key that connects history. Jesus is the key that opens the door to the Davidic kingdom to all. You could just take this one and create a whole sermon out of it if you wanted to, right? Jesus holds the key to the heavenly kingdom, and those of you who've been following our pluralism study, we would say Jesus is the key to God. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Andre Crouch, thank you. Yeah. You got that? Okay. There's a verse about the rod of Jesse, or sometimes it says branch of Jesse. Do you have that one? Either of you? Branch of Jesse, rod of Jesse.
O come, thou rod of Jesse,
There you go.
free, thine own from Satan's tyranny. From depths of hell thy people save, and give them victory o'er the grave.
So who's got that passage from Isaiah 11? I
I've got
ask you to find.
It's here.
Yeah, can you find it? Okay.
Yeah. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord, and his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. More?
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Okay.
So you see the direct reference out of Isaiah 11 that's picked up here, where Christ represents the branch of the tree of Jesse, right? Are any of you familiar with the Jesse tree tradition at Advent? This is a thing some people do as well. I've never practiced this. Have any of you done a Jesse tree? Yeah, it's on the back of that, yeah. I don't remember what you do, because I've never done it.
Start a Jesse tree tradition in which ornaments representing various biblical figures and events in the redemption story are placed on a tree. There are stories unfolding one at a time each day of Advent, building up to the arrival of Jesus. This is a way to bring children into the spirit of the Advent season through biblical stories and images. It's almost like a menorah, isn't it?
Well, I think what it's
Lighting
like that we have
something every
here
night.
is very much like our Chrismon tree that goes up in the narthex. But I think it's not there yet. Is it there? I clearly did not pay attention this morning, guy. The Chrismon tree that has all of the hand-stitched, cross-stitched names for Jesus, right? Which is very similar to the idea of this Christmas carol too, just taken to a much greater extreme. Then the last verse of this that we've already heard is the one that refers to O come, thou wisdom from on high, and something, all things.
And order all things far and nigh. To us the path of knowledge show, and cause us in our way to go.
So this is a reference to Jesus being the wisdom of God. Now, if you follow the theological biblical trail on this, it goes all the way back to Genesis 1, when we're taught that, and there's, I think it's Proverbs 8:22 maybe. I'm not sure about that. I think that's right. Where there's a reference that says the first thing God created was wisdom. And if you go then and apply that to Genesis, and you connect the dots on all this, there's a tradition that considers Jesus to be the representation of the wisdom of God. I'm writing some curriculum this week that I've just dealt with this on a passage from Colossians that references Jesus as creator and redeemer, and the reference goes back through this ancient hymn of praise that calls Jesus the wisdom of God, right? And there's the connection on this. So what I want you to see about this Christmas carol is the incredible biblical richness. I mean, you could take this carol and pull it apart and do a multi-week study on all of the things that are in there, because it's so rich in time. And to connect this to our beginning conversation, this was not the product of one monk somewhere sitting down and writing this intricate carol. It's the process of time where people have added and added and edited and added. And so you could go find a lot more verses that go to this Christmas carol, but over time they sort of got settled down into the 5 that we have today that are much more common, at least in American versions of that. So when we sing O Come, Emmanuel, which I think we'll sing in worship next Sunday, as I recall, think about all of the imagery that's in there and try to pick out those names for Jesus and think about the meanings behind those as well. It's like a buffet line, right? There's so much in there that you can pick a lot of it out. What comments or questions do you have about this or the introduction to Christmas carols? Thoughts? Anyone? Does anyone like this carol?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Jim?
I just keep reading it, and although you say it's in reference to Jesus, and
Right.
yes, we now see it as, but I keep reading this like it's interbiblical, period, because everything seems to refer back to the Old Testament, and when we do pull verses out of the New Testament, it's in reference back to the Old
Oh,
Testament.
yeah, no,
it
you're
seems.
exactly right in your reading of it. That's why it was written that way, because the goal is to make a point. And by the way, some of you heard me give a lecture on this before. This is the same thing behind the Christmas portion of Handel's Messiah. Messiah was written for the express purpose of proving the divinity of Christ. And so you have you have Malachi and Isaiah and Zephaniah all brought into this and then mixed with the gospel passages to say, this was prophesied, this happened, they're connected, right? That's the point. And this carol has the very same issue. Yeah, that's the whole reason it's survived through time, is it's educational. Yeah. Other thoughts on this? Questions?
Would the Jewish people feel comfortable singing all
No.
these words?
No.
I mean, because they're all in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but I think we would be accused of manipulating them.
Yeah.
Oh,
Or
okay.
misinterpreting them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, fair question. Yeah, I've never asked a Jewish friend that, but it's a great question. I may be wrong about that. Okay, I'm not sure what we'll be talking about next week. It'll be some more Christmas carols. You guys gave me a long list of those, and I'm working through those. I'm trying to pick the ones that have the most interesting stories behind them, like this one, and we'll just see where we go. Show up, and we'll have fun with that as well. So goodbye to our live streamers. I hope you'll join us for worship in a few minutes as well. Leanna Colcar is preaching today at 11 o'clock. And Jared Jaggers preached at 8:30. Excellent sermon. Excellent sermon today. Couple of things as we move to prayer. We're so glad that you've joined us in Discovery class via live stream today. And we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning, about 9:45, 9:50, in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.